In the previous lectures, we saw that there is a strong, undeniable resemblance between the flood traditions in the Bible and Mesopotamian sources in both the general storyline and the specific details. How are we to explain this obvious literary dependence? Two main questions should be addressed. First, who influenced whom? Did the biblical scribes borrow a Mesopotamian story or vice versa? Second, after we establish the direction of borrowing, is there any way to determine in what historical period it occurred? The question of the direction of borrowing should be viewed in the broader cultural context. It is clear from our review of the extant materials that the flood tradition was deeply rooted in Mesopotamia. It is found in several different versions in both Sumerian and Akkadian. It is integrated into the most important canonical works of Mesopotamian literature, as well as briefly alluded to in other texts, such as the Sumerian King List. This wealth of sources may imply that the flood story originated in a Mesopotamian environment. In contrast, the biblical version of this story seems to betray some signs of foreign origin. Here is one example. God instructs Noah,
"And seal it from within and without with bitumen."
The Hebrew term kofer, in the sense of bitumen, is unique to this text. This word was borrowed from the Akkadian word kupru. Use of bitumen for external and internal sealing of ships was common in Mesopotamia. Thus, both the word kofer and the technology reflected in this verse seem to reflect a Mesopotamian rather than a local Canaanite environment. Another detail in the biblical story that might indicate the Mesopotamian origin of the story is the mention of the Mount Ararat as the ark's resting place. The exact identification of these mountains is disputed among scholars. However, the name is reminiscent of the famous toponym Urartu, which refers to a region north of Assyria in present-day Armenia. Scholars generally assume that the biblical Mount Ararat should be located east of Canaan in areas much closer to Mesopotamia. In addition to these specific details, which accord better with Mesopotamia than Canaan, there is also the general setting. Some scholars argue that the very idea of a flood that sweeps away the earth was more likely to have arisen in Mesopotamia, a land of rivers prone to floods, than in the rocky land of Canaan. Can we point then to a specific Mesopotamian flood text that stands at the background of the biblical flood story? The answer is generally negative. The biblical flood is probably not based exclusively on one of the Mesopotamian texts known to us. The parallels between the biblical story and the Mesopotamian sources do not concentrate in one particular Mesopotamian text. The plot of the biblical story is very similar to that described both in Atrahasis and Gilgamesh. However, other details are known from different sources. For instance, the biblical reference to the first day of the month with regard to the end of the flood is only paralleled by a similar date in the flood tablet from Ugarit. There are also other pieces of evidence that indicate that the biblical scribes were familiar with additional Mesopotamian flood stories that have not reached us. More information about this issue is found on the course website. There remains the historical problem of when the Hebrew authors came into contact with Mesopotamian flood traditions. Any answers to this question must remain conjectural. We cannot rely on the dating of the flood story in the book of Genesis because we do not have hard data relating to the time when it was composed. Scholars have different opinions regarding this issue, which is connected to the general problem of dating of the Pentateuch. But the various suggestions are all hypothetical. We cannot date the biblical flood story with certainty. What we have left are some archaeological hints. In the 14th century BCE, Canaan was under some Mesopotamian influence. Akkadian language served as an international language, and Mesopotamian culture spread westwards towards the Hittite kingdom, Syria, Canaan, and Egypt. Thus, a fragment from the Epic of Gilgamesh was found in this period in the city of Megiddo in Canaan. There are also indicators that Canaanite authors of the time were familiar with Akkadian literature. Some scholars therefore suggest that the flood story traveled from Mesopotamia to Canaan during the 14th century BCE and was adopted by the Canaanites. According to this theory, the Israelites did not inherit the story directly from the Mesopotamians, but rather via Canaanite mediation. This is only one possible hypothesis. The fact remains that we simply can't tell precisely when and how the flood story found its way from Mesopotamia to Israel. For this reason, the next lectures will not focus on historical questions, but rather on questions of theology and thought, where we stand on safer ground.